Okay, thanks. I'm Mike Hartmann, joined by my longtime Bradley Foundation mentor, Dan Schmidt, who also co-edits the Giving Review, for a conversation with Terry Considine. We know Terry from his longtime service on the board of the Bradley Foundation, but he's many other things, including a real estate investor on the order of decades, founder of Aimco. We might talk about that. He's been active in his life in politics and philanthropy, but it all started in San Diego. Terry, how does a nice San Diegan like you end up in Colorado?
I'm the fourth of 11 kids, big Irish Catholic family. Grew up on a cattle ranch. Got sent east to school because the nearby schools were the last mission founded by Father Sarah, still serving the Indians, and they didn't necessarily go to high school. And so mother and daddy thought I should, and I went back to Groton School and Harvard College, Harvard Law School, and met a beautiful girl there. And Betsy, we've been married for 46 years, and she thought California was too fast, too much sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And Colorado was a compromise, and it's been a wonderful choice.
Yeah. Now, Terry, keep it simple for us, but tell us about Aimco.
Aimco is a REIT, which is to say a real estate investment trust. Its shares are traded on the New York Stock Exchange. It's one of 8 public companies I've done, which are 6 of which are in the real estate business, and they all at this point have some focus around owning and operating apartments. And there have been some years we've been the largest owner in the country, and at this point I would say we're just the best.
Yeah. And what has what has your business success taught you about philanthropy? Were there days you thought of the REIT while sitting in board meetings of Bradley?
Well, there's a difference, and philanthropy can be a little bit like politics, where results don't matter, and expertise is not required. And so what is true about business is that focus helps a lot, and your results are measured and they're agreed metrics. And if you don't succeed, bad things happen.
Terry, can you identify any particular experiences you had in your education, professionally, personally, which over the years, bringing you to Bradley for us, that really sort of began shaping and did shape your thoughts about not so much the business of it, but the philanthropy and what was important if you were going to be not just charitable, but strategic about the charity and the giving that you wanted to do in philanthropy?
Well, I think of 2 things, Dan. One is the example of my parents, who felt that philanthropy or charity was an integral part of life, and that it wasn't something special. It was what you did, and that we're all, in a sense, trustees for a time of whatever resources we have today. The other was a question I was asked by a business friend of mine, good friend of mine here in Denver, a man named Larry Meisel, who saw something I'd done, which he liked. But he asked the question, did you work as hard on that as you did making the money to fund it? And the answer to that was no. It was a little bit of an impulsive behavior on my part. It was a worthy cause, but I was making the mistake that I've just described of in philanthropy and in politics. Sometimes people do things because their intentions are good, but not necessarily thought through how it's going to be achieved and how success is going to be measured. So Larry's question still resonates with me, that if I worked as hard as in giving as I have done in getting, and I would say that's true at the foundation as well, but we ought to think about it that way.
Thanks. Mm-hmm.
You have experience in politics that you've referenced there generally. Why don't you fill in some of the blanks? Tell us.
Well, I've always been interested in politics. I've worked in campaigns from early days in California, but in Atlanta and in Colorado. And so, but in Colorado, Bill Armstrong, U.S. Senator, was a great hero, close friend of mine. I ran his campaign for re-election in 1984, greatest political victory in the history of our state. And it had more to do with the candidate than with management, I can tell you. But we ran ahead of Reagan, and we carried all but 3 counties. We carried Boulder, Denver, and Pueblo. That's never been done. I would say that from that, I thought, well, this isn't that hard. And I ran for the Senate in 1986 and was defeated in the convention. I won election to the state Senate in a vacancy race in 87, was reelected unopposed in 88. And then I left in 92 to run for the US Senate a second time, where I won the Republican nomination, but lost in the general.
And how did politics, how should experience like yours influence philanthropy? To what's the interaction between?
Well, I would say the mistake or the question that I often or the conundrum I would often present to candidates is that there's 2 risks in an election. And the first we know, which is that you run and you might lose. But the second one is also important, which is you might run and win and not make a difference and waste your time. And so that's a conversation I've had with many candidates over the years, including one quite recently about it, which is that if you're in office, you only have a certain amount of capital, a certain amount of time, and it's better to go big and try to make consequential change than to wait and not rock the boat.
And you're saying that applies to philanthropy, or should be thought of?
And I think it does to a kind of what I would call strategic philanthropy. There's a certain amount of philanthropy which is caring for people, and that was a little bit like feeding people a fish as opposed to teaching them to fish. Both are important. People that are hungry need to be fed. And so I admire a lot of philanthropy that we're engaged in, or that Bets is engaged in, where we just help someone who's in a jam. But that's not as what we did at Bradley, the 3 of us together. We were more strategic, and we did a fair amount of helping people, but we were thinking about changing the world. And I think for your viewers, many of whom will be involved in that kind of strategic philanthropy, I think I would say big is better. And big doesn't mean change the way that, have the sun rise in the west, but just doing things that are going to have long-term consequences that will become self-reinforcing and not just require your attention and money today.
Terry, in that regard, talking about big and strategy and that kind of approach in philanthropy, what could you consider? I guess maybe it won't be hard for you to narrow down sort of what in your view, what was the biggest success, or maybe 2 big successes along those lines you just described with respect to Bradley's operation while you were there a long time as a member, then chair, and then what might have been a missed opportunity because we thought either too small or we were just right on the big, but the circumstances, as you put out in terms of time and available resources, just didn't work out.
Well, Dan, you will know well what is my favorite Bradley project, which is Encounter Books. I think the work there of providing a list of a pulpit for writers from our point of view, the work that was done by our initial publisher, whose name escapes me right now, but Jim Collier.
Collier and Horowitz, yeah.
Yeah, and now by Roger is fantastic, and I thought we could never replace Mr. Collier, but I think Roger's done even more and better. And if we didn't have that, we would be really worse off in terms of the whole dialogue and understanding of conservative ideas. So that's kind of a favorite, but it's because I like to read, and I always tried to stay ahead. But as you know, if you're on the board and on the staff, we would get a dozen books, it seems, a month, and it's hard to keep up. So, but that would be my favorite. I think the probably the more important is that we've done a good job of staying focused on our purpose and not drifting, and in making mid-course corrections, and that today the Bradley Foundation is very focused on very clearly identified values that would be consonant with what the brothers would have wanted and what our other donors would have wanted, and we should feel good about not having lost our way.
Terry, you're known as the father of term limits. Should there be term limits for program officers at foundations? Or, by the way, I guess, board members? I mean, this has been proposed. What?
Well, I think the answer to that is, of course, there are term limits. I'm personally here no longer on the board, so I mean it's applied. In our case, it was an age limit, but I'm not for across the board policy of turnover. It really requires individual judgment, and in a private enterprise or a foundation, it requires the hard decision making, because you're dealing with friends. It's always awkward to say to a director that probably you ought to consider something else once a quarter, because would rather have somebody else in your place. But that is in the private sector, that's something we have to do. I've had to do that with directors of public companies. It's a little bit different in political office, where we don't have the same markets and private consequences. But so I think that the rule of politics doesn't necessarily apply to foundation directors or program officers.
Mm-hmm. And that's also the case. This is really another version of a previous question. The time horizon of somebody who just won office. I mean, that person has a term, whatever it might be. And philanthropy, you might have decades. This is a question for if Encounter Books is your favorite grantee, that's not going to get your results in 2 or 4 years.
No. And I think one of the things that one of the opportunities of foundations or philanthropy is to take a longer view. But it's important to have a point of view, and it's important not to accept a pace that is so slow as to underutilize the asset and opportunities and urgencies that we face. Yeah. And so there are plenty of academic institutions that can take a long view, but the result is they don't matter very much. And so there's a tension between the longer view and keeping score. Well,
great. Why don't we finish up with part 1 there and pick up with part 2 in a bit.
Okay.